I start telling you something about the mosaics of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is my subject today, I thought I really wanted to say thank you for getting me into the BAMM fold a couple of years ago, because it really has transformed the way I look at the material I work with, be it for the Victoria and Albert Museum or more recently with St. Paul's Cathedral. And I think there's still a lot to learn, so I've got 1 or 2 slides where I need your feedback and input and your thoughts. So, well, let's just see how we get on. Why am I here today? The mosaics of St. Paul's Cathedral are, of course, not extremely recent. I will tell you a bit more about that. But a lot is happening at St. Paul's Cathedral at the moment, thanks to 2 generous sponsors. One of them is the Vivas Company. The other one is a lady called Lily Chung from Singapore, who have given us money to make the mosaics more accessible, because as those of you who have been to the cathedral will know, some of them are in the choir and therefore you can't always get there physically. Even if you are there, the lighting is not always ideal to actually see the mosaics. So there were a couple of things that we really wanted to get out of this project, and I listed them here. Number 1, which is what I hope to share with you here to some extent, new photography of all mosaics in the cathedral. That's well over 100 individual panels. That has happened. Then what we are going to have live in mid-November, and if I say we, that's the head of collections at St. Paul's Cathedral, Simon Carter, who sends his regards, but has to be at the cathedral to show the mosaics to a group of visitors. So since he can't be in 2 places at the same time, just imagine him to be here with us in spirit. This online catalogue that I've been working on will have 1 image per mosaic, plus this physical description, dimensions, what we know about the history of the piece and the iconography. And that's going live in mid-November. What's also coming out, and you're the first ones of the first members of the public to see it, is a guide, and it is the 3rd guide of the mosaics of St. Paul's ever since they were created. So it's quite exciting, with new photography, and will be available from the shop, if I'm allowed to make a bit of marketing here, again from mid-November. Alongside that, there is a Google project. So the Google Cultural Institute has agreed to look at the mosaics as well, make a feature of them on their website. And as part of that, of course, and equally important, there will be a new commission that David has already started working on, and that you will also present on at a study day that happens on the 13th of November, where I will also speak about the mosaics, again, along slightly different lines than today. So if you want to come and join us, it's free. It's at the Museum of London, and it will be in 5-6 presentations around mosaics at St. Paul's, how they were created, what their context is, conservation issues today, and the next steps, the future of mosaics at St. Paul's Cathedral. There's some leaflets on one of the tables at the back. So, let's get started. St. Paul's Cathedral, completed in 1711, the famous Christopher Wren building, completed in as far as a cathedral ever can be completed. And if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you can just about see the mosaics in the far distance. But I think what you get is a sense of what the building was when it was first completed, which is white. There's hardly any color. It's architectural ornamentation. But quite deliberately, people, that generation shied away from anything too colorful, too much figural decoration, because that was perceived as too Roman, too much St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The dome was only decorated in the 18th century with the frescoes by Thorngill, which are also not very colorful, but au grisaille, as it's beautifully called. They faded. And again, that brought the question up, should we do something about that decoration? But the question about mosaics for St. Paul's Cathedral is one that was first, as far as we know, published already in 1750, very much in comparison to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And the person who published the idea of mosaics for the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral was none less than the son of Christopher Wren himself. As so many sons of famous people, what he did, he wrote a biography of the father. That was his claim to fame, in a way. And in this biography, In this biography, he states that his father suggested mosaics as the right form of decoration for the dome of St. Paul's, very much along the lines of the cupola of St. Peter's, because of the durability, because of the beauty of the colors, and because of the celebration and the closeness to heaven. But because, he goes on, because that was not an established art form in Britain at the time, or in England, he's a bit less ambitious, that wasn't really given due consideration. So this paragraph in the Parentalia, this biography, lingered around and people knew about it. We don't really know whether Christopher Wren, the architect, the father of the biographer, actually ever thought about mosaics, but the dictum was there. And whenever the question came up, what shall we do with St. Paul's? What shall we do with the decoration? Do we need more color? Do we need more features in the cathedral? Mosaics came back into discussion. And the first mosaics that actually came in, therefore, were still very much along the lines of the Roman tradition in terms of style, and pretty much fit in the Renaissance, Baroque style that you would see in the mosaics of St. Peter's in Rome. These are mosaics that sit in the spandrels of the central dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. They were produced by Salviati. The earliest were installed in 1865, and the latest come in the 1890s. So you can see there's a long, long time span that is needed for 8 mosaics, which are admittedly quite big, but nonetheless could have been dealt with quicker. The design process was started in the 1860s. Every artist involved in religious work at the time, famous painters like Leighton, Alfred Stevens, who was involved in St. Paul's, get their say, and as you can imagine, there is always controversy if you have more than one person involved in such a discussion. At St. Paul's Cathedral, serious efforts to raise money towards new decoration were started around the mid-19th century, when Queen Victoria uttered that St. Paul's looks rather dull and a bit dirty, and then it was taken on board that something should be done. And again, mosaics come into the discussion. But as soon as the first mosaics were installed, there was a discussion, is that the right thing to do? And you might be aware that the 19th century saw this huge revival in a sort of Anglo-Catholic movement, and I won't go into detail about that myself because I haven't been in this country long enough to have figured out all the details and what went on, but it has a huge impact on church decoration and on the styles that are considered appropriate for art that goes into religious places. And the struggle was whether a Roman Catholic decoration that's so closely associated with Raphael, Titian, the Roman Renaissance, would be appropriate for the key church, the cathedral in London. I'm showing you here in the corner a little model that is still preserved in the collections of St. Paul's, and which illustrates the various ways in which the mosaic process was explored. Partly I'm showing you that because it shows it was painters made the designs. Those designs then were transformed into mosaics in the typical Salviati method. That means they were produced in an indirect method in Venice, shipped to London and installed, which of course makes the mosaics a process of copy, not what we discussed just now. It doesn't really bring the entire capacity of the art form to the fore. Around the same time, a really exciting other second project of mosaics took place and shape and is in the Crypt of St. Paul's to the present day. Ilona, I'm not quite sure where she is, and I just recently published an article on so-called opus criminale, which are refute marble mosaics made by female prisoners of 2 London prisons in the 1860s and the following decades. And I think certainly the most charming example I know, and in terms of design, probably the most challenging one in part, is the one in the Crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was designed by the surveyor of the fabric itself, F.C. Penrose, and you can, if you look very closely, let me see whether I can, this one, you can distinguish little panels. So the panels are small enough to be set in a direct method in prison, and then the panels were taken out of prison and installed, obviously by other people, in the cathedral crypt. And that was a larger undertaking. There are quite a lot of projects around, and the more we look, the more we can identify. And they all have these typical characteristics. It's that color scheme, it's refute marble, and it's separate panels that are small enough to be produced on a table. In St. Paul's, after the spandrels were started, there was a hiatus of about 10 years, and then in around 1870, a chapel at the northwest corner of the cathedral, the so-called morning chapel at the time, was reconsidered for decoration and recolorification, or whatever you want to call it. That was the first spot where they actually tried to introduce color in different materials on a larger scale. And again, mosaics became one means of doing that. The mosaic on the left-hand side is, I would say, a very typical Salviati product of the period. Again, the design would have been sent to Italy, it would have been created there, and just installed in the prepared panel slot. And the slot is pretty much what Christopher Wren already designed for the space, but there was no sort of articulation, there was no picture in that before. So that's the new thing. There's a new layer that's added to Christopher Wren's shell, as it were. On the right-hand side, we're already a step further, because this mosaic actually was made in London using materials produced in London by Powell's of Whitefriar, a class manufacturer that would continue to go on producing the smalti for the larger mosaic scheme that we will talk about in a moment. But what's interesting, even so, the material comes from London and the makers are possibly English, we're not entirely sure. The subject matter as such is even more Roman than anything so far, because it is a copy, an outright copy of a part of a Raphael fresco in the Stanze in the Vatican. So that still went on. But it was clear that there was a change of opinion, and several people were approached whether they were willing to contribute to a major scheme for St. Paul's Cathedral that would see the entire choir transformed. Among them, Edward Burne-Jones, who had just been, a couple of years earlier, worked on a mosaic cycle for a church in Rome, the first Protestant church to be built in Rome, St. Paul's within the walls. And these are mosaics after his designs. As you can see, they're quite typical, quite recognizable, his style. So that these were considered a huge success at the time. But when approached about St. Paul's, his comment was along the lines of, that's an interesting debate, but it is one that I want to watch from a safe distance, from far away, is what he said. And so he didn't want to be involved. The person that eventually did get involved was this gentleman here, William Blake Richmond. He's roughly the same age as Burne-Jones, but wasn't as eminent a painter by then. He was a professor and teacher. He stood in for Ruskin as Slate Professor in Oxford, and while doing so, he gave a lecture series on monumental painting, outlining his principles for large-scale decoration. And that, in a way, made him a very good choice for producing designs for a large-scale scheme for St. Paul's Cathedral. I just brought this picture along to give you an idea of what kind of monumental paintings he was doing at the time when he started working on the St. Paul's Cathedral scheme. So very much along the lines of what you would expect from a painter in Victorian England at the time. He worked on the scheme from 1891 onwards, huge investment in terms of time, in terms of his own personal money even. He wasn't that well paid. There are constant reminders in the archives that he is doing what he can, but there's a limit. He transformed his own studio in Hammersmith. The house doesn't exist anymore. It was called Beaver Lodge, had a huge garden close to the river, and started creating his own mosaic workshop there. So I think what really distinguishes him is that he doesn't really see that as I design and then they can make mosaics, but he wanted to understand how to make the best of the mosaics and bring out the best of the art form as such. He does give it credit as something that is independent and is not just a means of putting the designs of somebody else in a long-lived material. In 1896, the scaffoldings came down. There had been a period of about 5 years when people were kept guessing what was going on behind those wooden, or more or less above those wooden scaffolds. And there's a picture here from the London News, which shows us people looking up at this suddenly extremely colorful choir of St. Paul's Cathedral. And what they might have seen, among other things, is this Adam among the beasts, with a lioness to his right, licking his toes. It's believed that that goes back to the experiences of Richmond himself, who had a cat, and apparently the cat licked his foot every morning when he came out of the bath. This is a story of the many, many stories reported in the first guidebook to the Mosaics of St. Paul's Cathedral by Forrest Brown, Bishop Forrest Brown, who was the first bishop of Stepney, and a very prolific writer. One of his main key works is a 3-volume publication on the ice caves of Central Europe. So that gives you an idea of how wide-ranging the interests of bishops in the 19th century was. And he brings a lot of anecdotes along those lines, and they're actually quite good to know, even so there's no way of telling whether there's any truth behind it. Where there is an Adam, there's of course also an Eve, and we've got her here with a couple of tigers and 2 peacocks, so beasts, or animals rather, associated with India. So I think this is an interesting combination of this very Victorian, very British, pre-Raphaelite beauty with her flaming red hair, surrounded by animals from faraway parts of the empire. So the one thing to keep in mind about the scheme as well is it is a very British scheme. It is a scheme of empire. It celebrates everything to do with the achievements of the Victorian era in terms of iconography, but also in terms of material and making. There are a couple of designs that still survive. Life-size cartoons were made for each and every of the mosaics. 21 of them are still in the cathedral collection. Unfortunately, once in a while, really large pieces crop up at auction, and I found 4 or 5 that were sold over the last couple of years. So that shows they still seem to be around, and they are works of art in their own right. But it's interesting to see how they only in part really prescribe how to set the mosaics. So if you look at those scrolls at the base, they literally are, you can set your mosaic exactly following those. But then if you look at the bodies and the faces, that really was up to the mosaicists to work with Richmond himself and the assistants to create a mosaic out of that cartoon. So that is something that might require some more work and understanding going forward. It would definitely be very interesting to hear the views of practicing mosaicists on how that could have worked. It's important when you go to St. Paul's Cathedral today to keep in mind that what we see nowadays is a cathedral that's very different from what people would have seen in the 19th century. The watercolor that you see on the left-hand side was actually made in 1896, and it shows a much softer light, and it shows the different reredos altarpiece at the far end of the church. What we see there now is a 1950s construction with this sort of canopy-like piece that sort of obscures parts of the mosaics that would have been much better visible when they were first created. But most importantly, the stained glass windows that were designed by Richmond alongside the mosaics and very much using the same principles of composition and design have not survived the Second World War. Hence, that is something that we need to keep in mind when looking at those mosaics. I think that watercolor, which comes from the same series as the one you already had on the left-hand side, shows very clearly that there is a great emphasis on a reduced number of colors, strong contrasts, and working with symmetry and symmetrical compositions that you can see in the mosaics and in the stained glass windows. so that it almost can become a pattern that's going on at the back of the cathedral. And you don't need to focus on the Figaro depictions unless you want to. They only emerge if you focus a bit more, which is very clever, and one of the principles that Richmond stipulated for monumental decoration. He described different categories. I thought, as mosaicists, of course you are interested in who were the people who made those mosaics, and we do know who they are, and with the exception of one name, I'm afraid that's moved a bit across, they are all English, or have English names. They might have been Scottish. Davis might have been Welsh, but there's only one person with an Italian name, Gaetano Meo, who was one of the assistants of Richmond and quite a glamorous figure in the mosaic world at the time. The picture I show you next to it is just to illustrate the circumstances under which work took place. So that's one of those wooden platforms put up in the cathedral next to the windows of the main nave. We even have a picture of two mosaicists at work. It's, to the best of my knowledge, the only one that survives, and we might even know the name of the gentleman on the right-hand side. That might be Mr. Gregory, the foreman of the mosaic workers, trained as Powells of White Friars, and you can see them set a beautiful double symmetrical composition of tigers again. And what's interesting about this as well, they're literally sitting on the triforium, so the mosaic would be very much a similar part of the church as the upper banisters here, and underneath the upper row of windows, and they sit on a tiny ledge. That ledge is just over a meter wide, so you would assume there was a bit of scaffolding on the side to make sure they don't fall off. They just have taken some stools, which they turned on the sides, and they're sitting on them with their tools in hand. But what's also interesting is the box in front of them, which has 16 compartments. And as part of the exercise of cataloging the mosaics and following a hint in Forrest Brown's 1896 guide, I counted the different colors in the mosaics at that level. The others would have been a bit too far away. And it's literally between 8 and 12 different colors, not more. And that's all they need. So that might actually have been enough to hold all the different colors they needed for the mosaics. And the colors they use vary from bay to bay. This is the puzzling picture I was talking about earlier, just to give you another idea of how they actually work. Again, from the 1896 series of watercolors, which is why I'm not entirely sure that it does depict something that actually took place as depicted, because it would imply that an entire piece of mosaic on a quite sizable slab was hoisted into place into one of the spandrels, which would again imply that it had been produced elsewhere. We do know that some of the mosaics were not produced in St. Paul's Cathedral, but that was at a very early stage. And then very soon it was decided that that didn't get the results that William Blake Richmond and his team were looking for, and it was decided to produce all mosaics directly in situ. So this is just to show you where this mosaic sits, that you just saw being hoisted into place on the other screen. It is one of the earlier parts of the cathedral that were finished, hence it is possible, but on the mosaic you can't see no evidence of it having been produced elsewhere. What we do know is that the angel you see on the right-hand side here was made at Richmond's workshop in Hammersmith using a direct method, whereas the one on the left-hand side, which is the angel of the Annunciation, and has become our poster girl for the book, or poster angel, poster boy, poster girl, I'm not quite sure, genders of angels, difficult subject. Anyhow, and you can see there are only a couple of years between those two mosaics. So let's say one was produced in the early 1890s and the other one much closer to the opening date of 1896. But there is a massive difference in terms of how the entire design is approached, the kinds of colors which are used. So I'll just show you here the details which might make it easier to see what I mean. Whereas the first one, which you have on top here, is very much using metallic, very costly, smelty silver, gold, bronze-like even, but has not a lot of contrast and tries to have still very pictorial detail. The second one is reducing that to create effect, and I think it's the better mosaic for that reason. It has much less different colors, the palette is reduced, there's no more silver, only gold, and especially the face is outlined in a way that makes it much easier to read from a far distance, because if you stand in the cathedral, you will see that the top one is much less easy to understand in terms of this angel is holding a lance. It's one of the instruments of the Passion of Christ. That's hard to see in the cathedral proper. So the move to reducing the palette and to producing the mosaics in the cathedral was a full success. Let me now just give you a bit of an idea of what actually is depicted and the size of the scheme. So there's 3 so-called saucer domes, which are slightly flatter. I think it's a very apt description. And in those 3, the creation is addressed. So we've got the creation of the beasts, which we see here, just to give you a detail. And again, it's the beasts from around the empire. So there's on the right-hand side, it's a kangaroo, there's some elephants and hippos, a tiger, and so on and so forth. And a lot of abstraction going on already. It's probably quite difficult to see at those light levels, but from the 13th online, you can see them online as well and zoom in. The next up is the creation of the fish, which is much bluer, and again, symmetry and ornamental, an ornamental approach to actually creating figures is what's key to those. And to show you that what is depicted in the saucer domes then matches what you have on the sides, running along the triforium, I brought along this beautiful composition of 3 fish, not entirely biologically correct, which I think wasn't really the issue. But what I've done as well to give you an idea of how they actually set the mosaics is take a tiny detail from that mosaic to show you the different sizes of tesserae they use. The type of the gold leaf is applied to the tesserae, which are also used for quite a large part of the scheme for the reds. So it's a double use of one color. And what you can hopefully just about make out is that the surface is not entirely flat. That was one of the big surprises for me when I looked at those mosaics close up. So if that's a fish scale, that will be slightly undulating. It will slightly come out of the wall. If it's a snout of a fish, it will come out even further. The peacock feathers are beautifully shaped. So it's a bit of a relief rather than a flat surface, which actually makes it, again, easier to read from underneath. And there was a question in 1896, well, the question is maybe it's a bit of an argument, a public argument between Messer Powell and Richmond, whose invention that actually was, and hence who is the one who actually is behind the artistic side of the mosaics. That was never entirely resolved, but I would say the Solomonic answer is it was teamwork. Neither of them could have done it without the other. So if you then move down from the saucer domes, you have the windows in the cathedral, and they of course leave 2 slots on either side. These are used for prophets and biblical figures. I wanted to bring you those 2 because I think they are a celebration of making and of artists. These are Bezalel and Aholiab, I'm proud I could remember that without looking it up, who are the 2 artists, craftsmen, architects charged with the creation of the first temple and its equipment, as it were, including the Ark of the Covenant, which you can see on the left-hand side, just behind the figure of this man, just working on a basket. And so I think it's quite important that these are rarely presented, but here in St. Paul's Cathedral, they were chosen to be shown. One of the readings that has been suggested by other colleagues is that they are actually there because the Freemasons contributed to the funding of the scheme, and hence having craftsmen in that context was maybe a requirement. Either way, I think it's great they're there, and they're again a good way of showing how Richmond works with patterns and symmetry and so on within his even figural compositions. Further down, we have the arches to the aisles on the side of the choir, where the story continues starting from Genesis creation. Then we saw Adam and Eve in paradise already. Here they are in a less fortunate situation further down the line. So we've got the temptation, Eve on the right-hand side with the devil pointing towards what could be apples, and on the other side, Adam already turning away and an angel stretching out his hand saying, "Don't." That is the last part. So from that, the temptation and the expulsion, the scheme then moves on to the New Testament, and we've got the Annunciation. And that leads then to the actual Acts, which has the Apocalypse, and we've got Christ in majesty with the recording angels. And the recording angels on one side, on the left-hand side, they're rather sad because they have to record the souls that go to hell, whereas the ones on the right-hand side are slightly more cheerful. That's the souls going to heaven. And that scheme of the Apocalypse, just to round it up, expands into the side aisles, where you have these beautiful, purely symmetrical composition that always have just one little element that allows you to link them to one part of the Apocalypse. But that's purely, I think, for decorum. This is an exercise in symmetrical design. And even might not be able to see those red spandrels in the corner. They have Celtic ornaments. So what was quite important to Richmond is not to only go back to one style. He borrows from each and every style that came his way to create something that's truly unique and reflected the empire at the time. He then went on to do the central dome. They're slightly later, and these are the mosaics that are most easy to see in St. Paul's Cathedral today, even when the choir is closed, as I'm afraid happens much more frequently than you'd expect. Apparently Richmond made this very quick gesture just to think about what he wants there, and these two sketches are also preserved in the Cathedral collection, just to give you an idea. So before he thinks about any detail, it's symmetry that comes into play. And the top one here is presumably an early sketch for the crucifixion, which turns into a tree of life, and that's where there is a certain similarity to Burne Jones's work in Italy. But I think there are four mosaics of that type in the dome underneath the Salviati mosaics, and they are the last ones that were created, and they take the entire idea a step further. I also have the feeling that the colors that were used for those are slightly more vibrant than the colors used in the choir. This is the resurrection with this glorious feathered sun. You can see there's almost an Egyptian element, which I haven't seen on any other depiction of the resurrection before. All this comes into play. These are finished around 1902, 1904, but still that wasn't all that Richmond had hoped to do. We know from an 1896 interview when the scheme was first revealed that he had much major ambitions, which I think are actually quite timely for 2015 as well. He wanted to go back to the dome. He wanted that decorated in mosaic as well. That was supposed to show the heaven with all its angels, but underneath is this tambour, just underneath the whispering gallery, basically. And for that, he wanted to have a scheme that depicts, and I quote, all the great religions of the world. And that would have included Christianity, obviously, but also Buddhism, Muslim culture, Hinduism, all of that should come together in St. Paul's Cathedral. It was maybe a step too far, but I think it was a glorious, glorious idea to have. And with that, I want to thank you very much and remind you once more, if you want to hear more about the mosaics, do come to the study day. It's free on the 13th of November. And if you have any questions as well.